So, before we are glorified, we must go through some suffering in this world. And I just want you to listen to these verses as I read them out to you. Romans 8:18, for I consider that the suffering of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. 2 Corinthians 4:17, for our light affliction, which is but for a moment, is working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. 1 Peter 1:6, in this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while, if need be, you have been grieved by various trials. 1 Peter 4:12 and 13. Beloved, do not think it strange concerning the fiery trial which is to try you, as though some strange thing happened to you, but rejoice to the extent that you partake of Christ's suffering, that when his glory is revealed, you may also be glad with exceeding joy. Okay? And so, if we don't understand this biblical principle of hardship that's going to come upon us, that's when the doubt will start to rise. But when we learn that God's ways are mysterious, right? Then when these things come upon us, we can say, Lord, you know what you're doing. Your ways are higher than our ways. Your thoughts are higher than our thoughts. From him, through him, to him, right? To you be all the glory. Okay. So, with that being said, God's ways are mysterious. Let's look at Habakkuk 1:5-11. Look among the nations and watch, be utterly astounded, for I will work a work in your days which you would not believe, though it were told to you. For indeed I am raising up the Chaldeans, a bitter and hasty nation, which marches through the breadth of the earth to possess dwelling places that are not theirs. They are terrible and dreadful. Their judgment and their dignity proceed from themselves. Their horses are also swifter than leopards and more fierce than evening wolves. Their charge ahead. Their chargers charge ahead. Their cavalry comes from afar. They fly as the eagle that hastens to eat. They all come for violence. Their faces are set like the east wind. They gather captives like sand. They scoff at kings, and princes are scorned by them. They deride every stronghold, for they heap up earthen mounds and seize it. Then his mind changes, and he transgresses. He commits offense, ascribing this power to his God. God's response. Okay, that's what this is. This is God's response. It's not what Habakkuk was expecting. But what do we learn about God right here? Right? Because that's what's important. What do we learn about God? God was not silent. God was not indifferent. God is arranging the nations to fulfill his purpose. This is the word God gave to Jeremiah. In Jeremiah 1:9 and 10, it says this, Then the Lord put forth his hand and touched my mouth, and the Lord said to me, Behold, I have put my words in your mouth. See, I have this day set you over the nations and over the kingdoms, to root out and to pull down, to destroy and to throw down, to build and to plant. Okay? Through the prophets, God spoke to his people, but he would show his sovereignty by the prophecies fulfilled regarding other nations. Prophecy fulfilled was one of the ways that God's covenant people would get a spiritual reality check that God is faithful. This was a realization that God even gave to Nebuchadnezzar, right? So in Daniel 4:34 and 35, it reads this, And at the end of the time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my understanding returned to me, and I blessed the Most High, and praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is from generation to generation.
This call and your telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
All the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. He does according to his will in the army of heaven. And among the inhabitants of the earth, no one can restrain his hand or say to him, What have you done? These two verses really help us to understand Habakkuk 1:5 and 6. God is always at work. Even if we cannot see it with our physical eyes, we must understand it from a spiritual point of view. So, when we look at 5 and 6, God tells Habakkuk, Look Watch, be utterly astounded. Look, watch, and be utterly astounded. That's what he says in verse 5. Well, why? For I will work a work in your days. God takes full credit for what is about to happen. It's God's purpose, which you would not believe, though it were told you. God does not owe anyone an explanation. He doesn't owe an explanation to anybody. He's God. Here we see how God condescends. He comes down to our level. Yes, God is transcendent, above his creation, nothing like his creation. But he is also eminent, intimately involved with his creation. He's intimately involved in every aspect of his creation. That is the majesty of God, right? He is transcendent, completely opposite, above his creation, but he's also eminent, intimately involved with every aspect of his creation. Very beautiful, very, very beautiful attributes of God that we learn about in the Bible. But here in verse 6, look at how we read in verse 6. For indeed, I am raising up the Chaldeans. I am raising up the Chaldeans. Not only are God's ways mysterious, they are oftentimes misunderstood. Okay? They are oftentimes misunderstood. So this is going to be our second point. God's ways are misunderstood. Okay? So today we have the New Testament. So we know how it all ends, right? We have the book of Revelation, and so we have the wonderful truth of how it's going to end. But Habakkuk didn't know how it was going to end. Habakkuk didn't have the revelation that we have today, and so therefore that was the dilemma that Habakkuk was facing. We know that God has permitted all things to happen to prepare the world for judgment, because after judgment comes what? Glory. The worst judgment the world will ever see will be in the tribulation. Jesus says in Matthew 24:21, for then there will be a great tribulation such as has not been since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor ever shall be. After the tribulation, whether you believe in the millennial kingdom or the return of Christ, God's glory will be on display. But here's the issue. Okay, here's the issue. During the Great Tribulation before Christ returns, people misunderstood what God was doing in Habakkuk's day, and people will misunderstand what God is doing today. Now, we must not miss this. This is very important when we look at the Old Testament. In 722 BC, God used the Antichrist kingdom of the Assyrians to remove the northern kingdom of Israel. In 586 BC, God used the Antichrist kingdom of Babylon to destroy the temple and remove the people. 70 years later, the people will return and the temple is rebuilt. But in 70 AD, God used the Antichrist kingdom of Rome to destroy the temple. Okay, now why do I share all of this? Because we don't want to miss it. In the Old Testament, we're learning something about God, and the New Testament is only going to reveal something beautiful about the Old Testament. And here's what it is. In the end, the Antichrist kingdom of this world will once again be used by God to persecute the church, to purify the church, and when it seems like this Antichrist kingdom is succeeding, Christ will return for the final battle. And God's people will receive the end of their redemption, their glorified bodies. So when we look at the Old Testament, we see and we learn something about God. And in the New Testament, we learn that absolutely, in the Great Tribulation, right, in the Great Tribulation, God is once again going to use an Antichrist kingdom, right, to purify his church, to purify his people. And then what's going to happen is Christ will return. So Habakkuk is a glimpse, right? It's a shadow, it's a type of what is going to happen, of what God always does. But God is always faithful to his people. God is always faithful to his people. Now, how does all this relate to Habakkuk, right? So we look at all these historical facts, right? But how does this relate to Habakkuk? Well, look at how God describes the Chaldeans. And let us see if we can see this in the Antichrist kingdom today. This is what we will see in the following verses: self-assured, self-sufficient, self-defied, and deadly. That's how God is going to describe the Chaldeans. You got to remember, this is God describing the Chaldeans. Okay? So in verses 6 and 7, for indeed I am raising up the Chaldeans, a bitter and hasty nation, which marches through the breadth of the earth to possess dwelling places that are not theirs. They are terrible and dreadful. Their judgment and their dignity proceed from themselves. So this immediately speaks of arrogance. This is the arrogance, right, of this Antichrist Chaldeans or Babylonian nation, right? They're bitter, they're hasty, right? They march through the breadth of the earth, right? Their whole world is, as they feel, is their dwelling, right? They're terrible and dreadful. Their judgment and their dignity proceed from themselves, right? Think about that, right? Their judgment and their dignity, right? Their judgment, they determine what's right, and their dignity, right? Their respect, their class proceed from themselves. This is the epitome of arrogance. This is what arrogance is, right? They believe that they can take on the whole world and conquer the whole world. So this speaks of arrogance, right? So we can definitely see in the Antichrist kingdom today that same thing, arrogance, right? Which is completely opposite of God's kingdom. Look at verse 8 and 9. Their horses also are swifter than leopards and more fierce than evening wolves. Their chargers charge ahead. Their cavalry comes from afar. They fly as the eagle that hastens to eat. Verse 9. They all come for violence. Their faces are set like the east wind. They gather captives like sand. Okay, well, what does this speak of? They are relying on their advancement in war.
This call and your telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
Look at this. This is amazing right here. Listen to what the Lord. Listen to how the Lord describes this. They are relying on their advancement in war tactics. They are more advanced than anyone else, right? And that's the description. Their horses are swifter than leopards, more fierce than evening wolves, right? They have some really good horses, right? Their chargers charge ahead. Their cavalry comes from afar. They fly as the eagle that hastens to eat, right? That's their advancement in war tactics. That is definitely the Antichrist kingdom today, and that's definitely what we see today. Everybody's trying to advance in their war tactics, right? And today in our society, we're seeing it more and more as it flows into AI and as it flows into all this different type of war tactics that is so new, and everybody's racing. Every nation is racing to get the newest form of military tactics, right? So this is the Antichrist kingdom, right, that we see here. And then look at verse 10. They scoff at kings, and princes are scorned by them. They deride every stronghold, for they heap up earthen mounds and seize it. They look at obstacles as challenges, and they treat their opposition with contempt. Okay? They don't care about anybody, right? They don't care about anybody. They scorn anybody. They deride, right? And everything is just a challenge, right, that they just need to overcome. And they treat their opposition.
You have 60 seconds remaining.
And then we look at the verse 11. Then his mind changes and he transgresses. He commits offense, ascribing this power to his God. Pride. They have no idea they are being used by the one and only true God. Yet they give credit to their God, which is idolatry and blasphemy. They have no idea. They have no idea. They think that they're doing it by their own power and their own God, and they have no idea that they're fulfilling God's purpose. So we'll dive into a little bit more of that when we come back.